She was a gentle, compassionate woman with always a sparkle in her eye and a story to share. Seeing her in her ancient Victorian mansion in the Pennsylvanian little town of Millfield was a delight. My family met for the will reading following the funeral. Grandma Edith had left me her antique mirror, shockingly. It was a lovely work with elaborate engravings and a gold frame. I recalled it hanging in her bedroom, and as a child I had always been enthralled by it. I excitedly opened the mirror and mounted it on my bedroom wall when I arrived home to my Philadelphia apartment. It was then that I came upon a little envelope stuck at the rear. Inside came a note in Grandma Edith's recognizable handwriting. It said, "My darling Ethan, generation after generation in our family has carried this mirror. It presents considerable risk as well as great power. You have 3 guidelines to keep yourself safe. Never stare at the mirror totally dark. 2. Never gaze in the mirror and speak your own name. 3. Never let anyone else glance in the mirror. Recall, the mirror sees all and knows all. Watch closely, my darling. I loved you." "Grandma Edith," I said, staring at the message and shivering down my spine. She meant power and danger. In terms of the mirror, seemed to me always as simply a lovely antique. Grandma Edith had, however, always been a little superstitious as well. I first attempted to ignore it. I moved about my life as usual after hanging the mirror in my bedroom. Strange events began though. Out of the corner of my eye, I would catch flashes of movement in the mirror. When I turned to check, nothing there was. I could never make out the words, even though I felt I heard whispering emanating from the mirror. About a week after I'd hung the mirror, one night I woke up in the middle to use the loo. I froze, looking up in the mirror as I was washing my hands. I swore for a single second saw a face peering back at me that wasn't mine. She was a woman with dark, sunken eyes and thin complexion. Though I could not hear anything, she seemed to be shouting. Blinking caused the face to vanish. I told myself it had to have been a half-asleep hallucination, perhaps a trick of the light. Deeply, though, I knew something wasn't quite right. I developed nightmares from then on. Dreaming of the mirror, of being caught within it, I would pound on the glass and yell for rescue. I could see my bedroom on the other side in the nightmares, but everything was twisted somehow and incorrect. The subdued colors let everything seem to be fading away. I attempted to dismiss it as too much late-night horror movie binge or worry. Still, the dreams persisted, and they were so genuine. My heart thumping, I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as though I had just barely avoided something horrible. One night then, I broke the first rule. Saturday night, and I'd gone out with pals. After a few drinks, I returned home feeling quite intoxicated. Not having bothered to switch on the light, I staggered into my bedroom and collapsed on the bed. I remembered the mirror as I laid in the dark. Rising to sit, I squinted at it, hoping to see my reflection in the low light coming in from the street lamps outside. I first saw nothing at all. Still, my eyes changed and I began to see forms in the mirror. At first they were fuzzy, but they become clear with time. And what I observed sent my blood freezing. Although not as it is today, that was my bedroom. The furniture was rotten and collapsing. The walls were damaged and peeling. And there, midway across the room, was the pale woman from my dreams. Her long dark hair hung down her rear as she faced away from me. She spun slowly in the other direction. Her face matched what I had remembered, pale and skinny with those dark, sunken eyes. She was, however, grinning now. Wide and hungry, with too many teeth, it was a horrible smile. Her long, bony fingers curling in invitation, she lifted a hand and waved to me. Though I tried to close my eyes and turn away, I couldn't. Like I was frozen, Caught by her look, she moved slowly toward me. The mirror rippled with every stride as though the surface of a pond disturbed by a tossed stone. She kept coming from the edge of the mirror, her hand out of the glass reaching for me. I cried. The sound seemed to pull the spell apart, and I hurried from the bed, turning on the light switch. The room was ablaze with light, and when I turned back to face the mirror, it was once more a typical reflection. I knew, nevertheless, what I had seen, and I knew I had violated one of Grandma Edith's policies. Things deteriorated from that evening on. Even without looking in the mirror, I began to see the pale woman. Out of the corner of my eye, in shop windows, in the reflections of puddles on the pavement, I would catch fleeting looks at her, always grinning that awful smile, always calling me to approach. I began to believe I was going crazy. I cannot eat and I couldn't sleep.
Declaring I had the illness, I phoned in sick to report to work.
Leaving my apartment made me nervous as I could see what. And then I breached the second rule in a moment of worn-out desperation. Perched in front of the mirror, I was staring back at my own sloppiness. In a few days, I looked to have aged 10 years, my skin pallid and clammy, my eyes bloodshot. "What from me do you want?" I spoke to the mirror quietly. "Why are you engaging in this?" There was quiet for a minute. I heard it then as well. From the mirror itself, a whisper, "Ethan." I stopped. Though the voice was smooth and feminine, something was wrong with it. Something icy and dead. "Ethan." It hushed once more. "Come see me, Ethan," I answered without thinking. "Who are you?" I knew I was wrong the instant the words came out of my mouth. Looking in the glass, I had murmured my own name. I had defied the second rule. Once more the mirror began to waver, the surface stretching outward as though something were pushing from the other side. Heart hammering in my chest, I staggered back. The glass cracked then as well. A hand, pale and bony, reached across the fractured mirror and grabbed at the air. I turned to flee, but I stumbled over something catching my ankle. I dropped hard, the floor pounding against my head. I heard the pale woman's voice, no more a whisper but a triumphant yell, as night closed in all about me. "You are now Ethan's mine. Always." Head throbbing, my entire body hurting, I woke up in a hospital bed. I momentarily found myself unsure of what had happened. Then all came flying back. The mirror, the pale woman, the broken glass. When a doctor arrived, she said my neighbor had called after hearing me yell. Surrounded by broken mirror, they had discovered me comatose on my bedroom floor. I was lucky. I had minor wounds and bruises and a concussion. It might have been very worse. I kept from the police and the doctor what had actually happened. I knew they would not believe me. Hell, I hardly thought it possible for me. I said it was only an accident. I must have stumbled and dropped into the mirror. They ordered rest and released me from the hospital with a painkiller's prescription. But I knew I couldn't stay at my house as soon as I arrived. Not with the damaged mirror still hanging on my wall. Not with the pale woman still murmuring in my dreams. After packing, I booked into a low-cost motel on the outskirts of the city. Searching for something to do, I sat on the lumpy bed, glancing at the dirty carpet. Though I considered phoning my folks, what would I say? That I could be seeing a ghost in a mirror? They would have assumed I had gone crazy. No, I had to manage this alone. That evening I did not go asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice calling my name. She showed me. I walked a tiny motel room, leaping at every old building creak and groan. I decided early the following morning. I had to return to my flat, confront the mirror and the pale woman. I refused to have terror rule my life. The mirror was still there when I returned to my apartment, the broken glass glistening in the sunlight coming through the window. My heart thumping in my chest, I inhaled deeply and moved toward him. And at that I noticed it. Words were carved there on the mirror's wooden rear, words I had not before observed. I bent in closer, squinting to see them clearly. Eliza Blackwood, between 1845 and 1870, condensed to the mirror for her transgressions, condemned to linger the living until her soul is released. My blood came cold. Blackwood Eliza, the pallet lady. She was imprisoned in the mirror, yet real. But what sins she had done, and how could I be meant to release her soul? Over the next 2 days, I investigated, pounced on historical data and past newspapers. I then discovered the solution at last. In the 1860s, young Eliza Blackwood lived in Millfield. She had been accused of cursing her neighbors and bringing about failing crops by witchcraft. She had been tried, punished with hanging execution. She had cursed the mirror, though, before she passed death. Had promised her soul would be imprisoned within it till the curse was broken. And I knew then what I had to do. The third and last rule needed breaking. Someone else had to check the mirror on my behalf. I phoned my buddy Sarah, the only person I trusted enough to be honest with. She arrived, wide-eyed as I went over all that had happened. Standing in front of the mirror together, I inhaled deeply and murmured the words I had come onto in my research, the phrases meant to lift the curse. Eliza Blackwood releases you from your incarceration. May your soul at last rest. Not one thing happened for a moment. The mirror then began to shine, a brilliant blind light engulfing the room. Sarah gasped. I heard her say my name. Then everything darkened. Sarah was kneeling next to me as I woke up on the floor. The mirror vanished, leaving just a blank wall from which it had hung. Sarah helped me to get to my feet. Her face was pale and startled. What happened? She inquired. Where went the mirror? I shook my head and felt an odd calm go over me. It's over, I said. Eliza's soul is liberated. The curse is lifted, and I knew everything felt different as I gazed about my place. The terrible sense of anxiety that had dogged me for so long had lifted from the shadows. I understood I would never forget the pale figure in the mirror or what had transpired. Still, I also knew I was free now, released from the curse, from the anxiety, and I knew I was ready to start living once I held Sarah and felt her warmth, all set to meet whatever the future could present, regardless of how frightening it seems. Since at the end it is all we can do. Face our demons, face our worries, and keep on forward, one daily, one step at a time. Perhaps also, just maybe, we will make it across to the other side. To somewhere the light always shines through while the shadows cannot reach us. It all began some months ago as I was browsing a neighborhood garage sale. About 1 hour outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I live in the little town of Millfield. Not much ever occurs in this one of those locations where everyone knows everyone. Anyway, I came upon an antique radio while sorting through an old crate of equipment. With these complex dials and switches, this was a true beauty, all polished wood and shining metal. I couldn't resist since I've always liked old technologies. I carried it home after paying a neat $20. When I returned to my house, I laid the radio down on my kitchen table and began experimenting with it. Expecting the classic static and hiss of an antique radio, I plugged it in. Rather, I heard something else. First weak, then as I changed the dials, it got clearer. Though not anything I had ever heard before, it was music. With this crackly, twisted quality, it sounded old, like truly old. Listening, I experienced an odd feeling sweep over me. The room seemed to be getting colder, the shadows in the corners sinking farther. I dismissed it, knowing I was only allowing my mind to run wild. That is when I came upon the note. It was nestled below the radio, a folded yellowed paper sheet. I grabbed it and perused it. Said, "Congratulations on your vintage radio acquisition. Please apply these 4 guidelines to provide the greatest possible experience. 1. Just run the radio between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. 2. Never keep the radio on for more than 1 hour at once. 3. Try not to modify the frequency or station. 4. Turn off the radio right away if you come across anything odd. Ignoring these guidelines might lead to unanticipated results." I fixed my gaze on the note and shivered down my spine. Unintentional outcomes. What the devil did that mean? Part of me wanted to simply toss the radio, label it as a strange yard sale item. Still, another side of me, the inquisitive side, cannot resist. I turned on the radio that evening, right after 6 p.m. All I heard initially was motionlessness. But I began to pick up something else as I experimented with the dials. Although it was a news program, their suggested date was completely off. They were discussing events that decades before had occurred as they were occurring right now. As the speaker detailed the beginning of the Apollo 11 mission, the first moon landing, I listened, captivated. It seemed so genuine, so vivid, as though I were truly there at the moment. Looking at the clock, I realized I had been listening for around 36. Recalling the second rule, I turned off the radio fast. I kept tuned in over the next few evenings, always mindful of the guidelines. I listened to broadcasts spanning many decades, from the conclusion of World War II to JFK's murder to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It like having a secret view into the past, a window into history. Still, something changed around 1 week after I had acquired the radio. The signal began to weaken as I was listening to a 1940s broadcast with some big band tunes. I played about with the dials, attempting to bring it back in. I heard that at that point. A voice whispering under the song. I first had trouble seeing the words, but my blood went cold as I listened more closely. The voice hushed. "I see you. I know you are paying attention." Heart thumping, I shut the radio off. Right, it had to be my imagination, simply some strange interference, a mental trick. Deeply though, I knew it was something more. The whispers increased louder, more forceful over the next few evenings. Starting to block out the transmissions, their terrible sibilant hiss filled the room. I tried to ignore them and concentrate on the historical voices. Still, it was growing more difficult. One night, then, I made a mistake, a great, stupid error. I went against the third rule. Late, almost at 3 a.m. For hours I had been listening to the radio, sliding across the frequencies in search of that elusive window into the past. I was worn out, my eyes weighed, my head fuzzy. And I heard it at that point, from a period I couldn't quite remember, a program I had never heard before. Speaking quickly, the announcer's voice cracked with static. "This is a transmission under emergency conditions. Change your set, not at all. The next message is quite important." My heart thumping, I bent in closer. The announcer went on, his voice becoming warped. "They arrive here. They are on their way for you. Refrain from trusting the voices. Refrain from believing the whispers. They will mislead you into the black between frequencies." I got a shiver going through me. Between frequencies, darkness, what that meant. My hand shaking, I grabbed for the dial. I knew I should not, knew I was violating the law, but I couldn't control it. I had to find out more. I just a fraction of an inch turned the dial. My teeth hurt from a high-pitched wail replacing the sudden transmission cut off. I suddenly could hear the whispering, louder than ever, a chorus of voices all speaking simultaneously. "You broke the rules," they hissed. "You let us into here. You now are part of us." My hand would not move as I tried to switch off the radio. I felt as though I had frozen in place. The room around me began to flutter. The shadows became darker, the walls bent and warped. Something ancient and evil I could feel moving in the darkness. I then noticed it, a face peering from the darkness. She was pale and skinny, with sunken eyes and a mouth too broad. It flashed at me, a terrible, ravenous smile. It said, "Welcome, welcome to the frequency of the damned." I let out a shout. I have no idea how long I yelled for, how long I sat in the dark, the radio screeching and hissing, the whispers biting at my head. But finally I had to have passed out. My next awareness was awakening on the floor, the radio black and silent next to me. I first felt as though everything had been a dream. A terrible and vivid dream. Then, though, I noticed the note, folded in my hand, and I knew it had been genuine. I tried to act as though nothing had happened, to go about my daily business. Still, I could sense it, always there at the brink of awareness. The gloom between frequencies, the whispering never fully gone away. I began to see things out of the side of my eye. Shadows moving on their own, faces peering out at me from the still TV screen. I refused to eat or sleep. I bit by bit was losing my sanity. One night then, I woke up and discovered myself standing before the radio. On, the dials quietly gleaming in the darkness. I couldn't recall getting out of bed and turning it on. Still, I was there, my fingers caressing the cool metal with outstretched hands. "Come to us," the murmurs whispered. "Visit the frequency of the damned." I pushed my hand away, attempted to resist. But I felt as though I was being dragged toward the black. The chilly nothingness between frequencies, the void yearning for my soul, could be sensed. Then I heard someone speaking. A recognizable voice slicing over the whispers like a lighthouse in the darkness. The guy who had reared me, my grandpa, had always been by my side. Though he had died years ago, I could hear his voice anywhere. "Finn," he whispered, his voice echoing and far. "Finn, you really have to fight it. You have to turn away from the night." I had a flash of hope and power. I concentrated on the voice of my grandfather and on the memories I treasured about him. I considered summer days spent fishing on the lake, of lengthy conversations on the porch swing, of the way he always made me feel safe and loved. I also gently, inch by inch, withdrew my hand from the radio. Though I ignored them, the voices got louder and more forceful. I concentrated on my grandfather and on the light he stood for. I threw myself away from the radio with a last surge of will. My heart thumping, I staggered back, panting for breath. The dials went dark when the radio turned off. And for a brief instant, just a second, I believed I saw my grandpa's face grinning back from the shadows. That evening, I did not fall asleep. Waiting for the murmurs to come back, I sat on the brink of my bed staring at the radio. Still, they never did. Just a harmless antique once more. The radio sat quiet and dark. I decided early in the morning. I could not risk the darkness returning or keep the radio. I had to exile it from my life permanently and get rid of it. On the outskirts of town, I drove out to the old deserted church. For me, in the past, it had been a haven where I could go to get some peace and clear my thoughts. I decided it was the best spot to bury the radio, anywhere. The radio buried under my arm made me uncomfortable as soon as I entered the cool, musty inside the church. Dirt covered the pews, the stained glass windows crumbled and faded. More than that, though, was involved. The air felt heavy, like though someone were watching me from the shadows. My feet echoed in the empty space as I headed to the altar. With somewhat shaky hands, I laid the radio down softly. Though I knew what I had to accomplish, I struggled to really get myself going. I heard someone call as I stood there staring down the radio. Though it was faint, like a whisper, I knew right away. It was my grandfather. "Finn," he said, his voice seemingly to emanate from everywhere and simultaneously from nothing. "Finn, you have to trash it. That is the only way." Tears stinging my eyes, I developed a lump in my throat. He was right, I realized. I couldn't simply leave the radio here. I couldn't let someone else discover it and get under its spell. I had to call it final once and once. My hands shaking, I grabbed a weighty candlestick off the altar. I hoisted it above my head and gasped raggedly. Then I brought it down on the radio, crying out anguish and wrath. The metal crumpled under the assault, the wood splintering. Tears running down my face, I struck it repeatedly until all that remained was a mound of broken fragments. Chest heaving, I stood there and felt weight lifting from my shoulders. It finished. The darkness banished, the radio wrecked. I became free. Still, I felt a shiver pass through me even as I thought it. Since deep down I knew the truth, there was nothing one could destroy between frequencies, that darkness. It lived in the shadows and the stillness in the margins. And I knew it would always be there. When I left the church, the broken radio remains left on the altar, watching for someone else to let in, tune in for. Over the next weeks and months, I aimed to put the whole affair behind me. I put myself into my job, into my connections and pastimes. I convinced myself that it had all been a horrible dream, a fantasy created in my mind. Still, occasionally late at night I would lie awake in bed and listen to the silence, and I could practically hear the whispering in that quiet. Faint and far away, but clear-cut. They sounded to be saying, "We're still here. We have Finn waiting for you, watching for your return to us." And in those times, my heart racing in my chest, I would experience a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I knew I could never really get away from the darkness between frequencies, no matter how hard I tried or how far I ran. I was carrying it now, a shadow on my soul. And all I could do was hope I was strong enough to withstand its siren call, to keep it at distance. Still, I understood the truth deep down, in the darkest recesses of my heart. The rumors would get too strong one day to overlook. I would find myself pulled back to the stationary and shadows one day. And aid me on that day, heaven, because that day I would be permanently dark. It all began 6 months ago when I was hired as a night shift librarian at the Springfield, Illinois, Oakwood Public Library. Since I have always enjoyed reading and the night shift meant I could study for my online classes during the peaceful hours, I was quite enthusiastic. This large, ancient 1920s brick and stone library featured expansive windows and was reminiscent of, although it was very eerie at night, I reasoned I would grow used to it. Mrs. Thompson, my boss, was an older grey-haired woman with tight bun always. She was pleasant enough, but something about her looked strange. As always, she was watching me. Mrs. Thompson showed me about the library on my first night. Up until we arrived at this door at the rear of the reference area, everything seemed normal. Made of dark wood, it had this strange sculpture of a tree with eyeballs in the branches. Mrs. Thompson said, This is the limited section, all serious. Most staff members as well as the public are off limits here. Inside, only senior librarians are permitted. I nodded, supposing it most likely just rare books or something. She then passed me an old piece of paper, though. Looking ancient, it was all yellow and brittle. 5 guidelines in elegant calligraphy were inscribed on it. Never alone enter the restricted area. From any book in the restricted section, never read aloud. Before midnight, return every book exactly where it belongs. Never take a book off the restricted section. Should you hear whispering coming from the shelves, leave right away and shut the door. Nervously laughing, I said, "These are jokes, right? Like to terrify the new guy?" Mrs. Thompson hardly grinned at all. She said, "John, these rules are deadly serious. Breaking them may have repercussions. Understand?" I nodded, still finding it some sort of strange initiation ritual. Mrs. Thompson left me to start my shift after making me swear to observe the policies. Early on in the first several weeks, everything was usual. I would work on my homework, aid the sporadic late-night student, and bookshelves. Still, I found myself obsessing over that limited area. There was what? Why are all the secrets kept? About a month into the work, one evening I was stocking bookshelves close to the restricted section entrance when I heard something. It seemed like whispering. Like someone else was having a chat across the door from other side. Trying to discern the words, I placed my ear on the wood, but they were too faint. Looking about, the library was deserted. We had been closed for hours, approaching midnight. I held my hand above the doorknob. Though I knew I shouldn't, curiosity was killing me right now. Just a moment to glance at. What could it cause damage to? Turning the knob, I pushed the door open. The whisper came to an instant stop. The room beyond was dark. Exit signs provided only illumination. Old bookshelves ran into the darkness. Like the instant before a thunderstorm, the air seemed weighty. I moved inside and the door softly clicked closed behind me. I got out my phone and turned on the flashlight, my heart thumping. The beam illuminated ancient leather-bound books with titles in languages I couldn't identify as it swept across the shelves. Moving further into the room, I observed something strange. Certain of the books looked to be flowing, just mildly, as though they were breathing. I persuaded myself in the low light that was only my eyes fooling me. I turned back just as a book caught my gaze. Bonded in dark red leather, it was smaller than the others. The title, English language, was Whispers of the Forgotten. I grabbed it without thinking off the shelf. I felt a zap, like static electricity, the instant my fingers brushed the cover. Once more the whispers began, louder this time. It sprang from the book itself, appeared. I unlocked it, and the whispers roared. Desperate to be heard, voices overlapping ranged from angry to plaintive. Terrorized, I dropped the book. It thumped against the floor, and all of a sudden everything stopped. Too quiet. Not even could I detect my own breathing. It was at this point that I observed the room's corners' shadows. They appeared darker somehow, and they were on their way. Heart thumping in my ears, I hurried for the door. I felt something sweep against my ankle as I went for the doorknob. Down, I noticed a tendril of shadow encircling my leg. I jerked my foot away and shot through the door, slamming it closed behind me. Leant against the wall, I gasped for air. What the devil had just happened? Had I dreamed everything? Then, though, I discovered something that caused my blood to freeze. There, on the sleeve of my shirt, was a dark smudge, though it appeared to be ink. As I watched it moved, whirling like smoke before vanishing. I peered at the time clock. AM 12:05. Over less than 10 minutes, I had broken 3 regulations. I had no notion this was only the beginning as I stood there attempting to cool off. That my questions had started a process that would permanently alter my life. The next several days were unusual. I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows moving when they shouldn't. Books shifting on the shelves when nobody else was present. I tried to persuade myself it was only my imagination, that I was panicky over nothing. Deep down, though, I realized that evening had changed something. I kept what happened to myself. Who would accept my claims? I also worried about being let off should Mrs. Thompson discover I had entered the restricted section. I so closed my mouth and attempted to act naturally. Still, it was difficult. I began to get these bizarre nightmares. I was immersed in a vast library in them, where the shelves ran indefinitely. Books would fly from the shelf, their pages fluttering like wings. And always, like 1,000 voices all at once, there was this whispering. My heart pounding, I would wake up in a cold sweatshirt. I could swear occasionally that just after waking, I still heard the whispering for a few seconds. It was beginning to mess with my head, really seriously. I was doing my regular shift when this man entered about 1 week following the event. Tall and thin, he had unkempt grey hair and these vivid blue eyes. Approaching the desk straightforwardly, he remarked, "I need to see the librarian." I got perplexed. On call is me, the librarian. Can I be of assistance to you?" He gave his head a shake. "Not you, though, the bookkeeper, the one looking after the limited area." My stomach sank. How would this man have known about the restricted section? I attempted to seem laid back. "I apologize, sir. However, I have no idea what you mean. Here there isn't a restricted section." The man hunched in close proximity. His eyes were big, and I could see he was slightly shaking. He said, "Listen to me, softly. They are waking. The writings. They are murmuring right now. You owe it to the librarian. Tell her it's beginning yet once more." He turned and fled the library before I could answer. Stalled there, shocked. Just what the devil was that about? And why did it feel as though he understood something about what had happened to me? I tried to clear it from my head and concentrate on my job, but I kept, considering what the man had said as the evening wore on. They are waking up. It resembled what I had gone through in the restricted sector. I heard it while reorganizing some volumes in the history area, about 11:30 p.m. whispers. This time, though, it was not coming from behind the limited section door. Coming from the book I was holding was this. I dropped the book as though it were burning. It opened on the floor, and I believe I watched the words on the page shifting and reorganizing themselves. Blinking, they were normal once more, but the whisper persisted. I gazed about the library. Every book on every shelf seemed to be vibrating somewhat. The whispers grew louder, then became a dull roar. Though it didn't help, I covered my ears. The voices entered my head. Abruptly, a book shot from an adjacent shelf, almost striking me in the face. Then another, and still another. Books were flying all around shortly, their pages flitting frantically. It sounded exactly like my dreams. I went for the limited portion door. I'm not sure why. Perhaps I was merely panicking, or perhaps I could have found solutions there. My shoulder was touched as I reached for the handle. I whirled in search of Mrs. Thompson, but her appearance changed. Her hair was down, swimming across her shoulders like it was underwater. Her eyes had a gentle blue sparkle. "What have you done, John?" she begged. Her voice sounded oddly as though she was speaking from far away. "I'm sorry," I said, stuttering. "I intended not to. I just wanted to see." Her head shook. "One very strong force is curiosity, but some information comes at a very high price." The whispering became more audible. Now books were whirling around us like we were in the center of a paper storm. Mrs. Thompson lifted her hands and everyone halted at once. The books hung in mid-air, then softly floated back to their shelves. She said, "Come," opening the restricted section door. "You need to understand much more." Heart thumping, I trailed her inside the room. The air seemed weighty, as though we were underwater. Mrs. Thompson turned to face me after marching to the middle of the room. "This library," she continued, "is more than just a collection of books. It defines a line separating worlds. The books in this section feature knowledge and beings from elsewhere. Our responsibility as librarians is to maintain that barrier intact." Trying to digest what she was saying, I shook my head. "But how? Why I?" Mrs. Thompson sighed. "John, we do not choose this position. It points to us. Opening that book woke you something. You are now linked to this area, either favorably or negatively." She pulled down a book from a shelf, the identical red one I had touched before. She walked. "This is Whisper's Codex of Notes. It speaks the voices of many entities from worlds beyond our own. Opening it will have given them a footing in our world." I got sick. "What then is our next step? How are we to stop it?" Mrs. Thompson had a grim look. "We are powerless to stop it. Still, we are able to contain it. That's the reason the regulations exist. There are mystical walls keeping the opposite side at distance, not only rules." She passed the book to me. "You open this, John. You have to learn now to close it. Be advised, though, the entities on the opposite side will seek to stop you. They wish to be free." The whispering resumed as though on demand. Still, this time I could practically decipher the phrases. Promising knowledge, power, responses to every question I had ever asked. They were beckoning to me. Terrified, I turned to gaze at Mrs. Thompson. "I'm not sure whether I can do this." She laid a hand on my shoulder. "You really have to. Its safety determines the state of our planet. Are you ready to really be a librarian?" I looked down at the book in my hands and swallowed fiercely. I understood that my life would never be the same should I agree. Still, what option did I have? I nodded gradually. "All right," I replied. "Tell me what I ought to do." The next several weeks were busy. Starting teaching me in what she referred to as the art of librarianship, Mrs. Thompson, sometimes Evelyn, told me to call her, but this had nothing to do with book cataloging or locating research resources for individuals. This was basic magic, pure and uncomplicated. I developed the ability to detect the vitality of the books, to distinguish between those that were only books and those that were something else. Evelyn gave me words of power to quiet a restless tone or suppress a particularly lethal bit of information. Nevertheless, it was not simple. Evelyn dubbed the entities on the other side the unwritten. They refused to be confined. Constantly whispering to me, they sought to lure me with promises of superhuman knowledge and ability. About a month into my training, one evening I was rehearsing a sealing spell on a book of ancient summoning ceremonies. With its pages whirling frantically and symbols shining on the cover, the book was retaliating. I heard a voice and was sweating, trying to maintain the spell. "John," it murmured. It sounded like my dad, who had died while I was a small child. "John, let me say something. I have all you have ever wanted to know right here. Regarding me, regarding the reason I left. Your only action is opening the book." I paused for a second. The voice sounded quite real, quite like my dad. Then, though, I recalled what Evelyn had taught me. To fool you into allowing them out, the unwritten will say anything, pass for anyone. I completed the spell, gritting my teeth. The book slammed closed, and before it vanished, a succession of brilliant symbols showed on its cover. Weary, I slung against a shelf. Evelyn came smiling from among the stacks. "John, well done. You are picking things up fast." I nodded, too weary to talk. Inside, though, I sensed a little flash of pride. I was improving at this as well. The weeks passed and I developed a schedule. I would sleep during the day and try to keep up with my web lectures. I worked my shift at the library at night, which now included routine patrols of the restricted section and handling any incidents that arose. And there were lots of mishaps. Books meant to bite everyone who came into touch with them, shadows that moved on their own. I even had to cope with a mirror showing individuals their own deaths once. That evening was challenging. Maintaining it all a secret became the toughest challenge nevertheless. I couldn't tell my friends why I never wanted to hang out anymore or explain to my mum why I was always so exhausted. Living in two worlds, and it was beginning to wear me out. Then arrived the evening that fundamentally changed things. It was Tuesday, as I recall quite precisely. During my regular visits in the limited sector, I came upon something strange. One of the tables had a book on it, a Rule 3 violation. I knew it as I approached. Starting all this, the book was the Codex of Whispers. I had not pulled it out though, and Evelyn was on some sort of librarian convention outside town. Planning to put it back, I grabbed for the book, but the muttering began as soon as my fingers came upon the cover. Louder than in years past, and for this time, I could grasp every word. They informed me of the actual purpose of the library and the authority concealed among its books. Evelyn and the other senior librarians, they claimed, were exploiting people like me as pawns while keeping this authority for themselves. I sought to resist, to recall my instruction. Still, the voices were really persuasive. They gave me pictures of the knowledge I may acquire as well as my possible actions. They guaranteed I could bring my dad back, for actual this time. I had taken out the book before I understood what I was doing. The pages started to shine and the whispers became to roar. Like a powerful wind trying to draw me in, I sensed something dragging at me. It was too late even as I tried to close the book. The pages turned more quickly and the brightness grew blinding. I felt myself attracted toward the book and raised off my feet. I felt someone grab my arm just as I was ready to be hauled in. Evelyn turned around. She had to have gotten back early. She was yelling something, but over the unwritten scream I could not hear her. Evelyn dragged me away from the book with a strength I was unaware she possessed. Her fist shining blue fire, she pushed me away and turned to face the Codex. She started chanting in a tongue I couldn't identify. The book started to close, slowly at first, then quicker. The light darkened, and the booming diminished too. The Codex crashed close with a last thunderclap. The quiet that fell suddenly was overwhelming. Looking up, Evelyn was looming over me with a face that mixed disappointment and wrath. "I'm sorry," my voice quivering. "I didn't meant to. They were so convincing." Evelyn slumped. "I know, John. Masters of manipulation, the unwritten are still. You need to be more robust. The fallout from failure is too tremendous." She pulled me to my feet. "Hat would have been done?" I inquired. "If you hadn't stopped it?" Evelyn wore a dark face. "The unwritten would have exploded through. There would have been beings beyond human comprehension all across our planet. Pandemonium, mania, the end of everything we currently understand. I grew ill. I had gone rather near to doing it." "Hat are we to do now?" I asked him. "After my wife Amara came over this fantastic bargain on a remote cabin rental, we decided it would be the ideal vacation spot for our two children, Levi and Mila." Long and meandering, the drive up to the cabin carried us deep into the Rockies. I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sensation that had crept into my stomach as we approached. The air itself seemed to be weighted with something I cannot quite identify. When we got to the cabin at last, it was late dark. The sun had already sank below the horizon, creating lengthy shadows across the area housing the cabin. With a small porch out front and a chimney that appeared to have not been used in years, this was a rustic little thing, all worn wood and stone. I found a piece of paper nailed to the front door as we pulled our bags from the van. Written in a spidery, practically invisible handwriting, it was a list of guidelines. Squinted to see the words in the last of the light, "Welcome to your mountain vacation. Please follow these 8 easy guidelines to guarantee a nice stay. Leave the cabin not after dark. 2. Nightly lock all windows and doors. 3. Keep not upsetting the woods cairns. 4. Should you hear murmurs, do not respond to them. 5. Bring no meat into the cabin. 6. See shadows in the trees, do not probe. 7. Never use the attic Ouija board. Every night leave an offering on the porch. Ignoring these guidelines might lead to nasty results. Enjoy your visit." Amara just laughed and rolled her eyes, so I read the list to her aloud. Exactly. Who develops this kind of material? Most likely, it's just a local trying to frighten the visitors. I laughed with her, but the guidelines made my skin crawl. Their phrasing was such, the sinister ellipsis preceding the reference to unpleasant consequences. But I dismissed it, thinking it was simply the eerie vibe of the venue getting to me. We unpacked our baggage and investigated the little comfortable quarters of the cabin. Excited, the children were racing from room to room, claiming their beds. Though first uncomfortable, I had to confess the setting had a certain appeal. I nearly forgot about the unusual set of guidelines the first night as we sat around the bonfire toasting marshmallows. Enjoying each other's company in the soft glow of the flames, we laughed and shared tales. But I couldn't get rid of the sensation we were being observed as the evening drew on and the children began to yawn. Half expecting to see a face staring in at us from the darkness, I continued peering out the windows. Telling myself it was only my imagination, I attempted to dismiss it. But I made care to confirm that every window and door was closed tightly when we curled up into bed that evening. I woke up to the sound of voices about 2 a.m. I initially assumed it was only the wind whistling through the outer trees, but straining my ears, I realized the whispering came from within the cabin as I lay in the dark. My heart hammering in my chest, I sat up in bed. Amara was still fast asleep next to me. Her breathing was steady and gentle. I got out of bed and approached the door, rubbing my ear against the hardwood. Now the whispering were louder, a mix of voices I could not exactly distinguish. They sounded as though they came from the living room, where we had been seated just a few hours earlier. My hand on the handle, I paused. "If you hear whispers, do not answer them." The 4th guideline from the list kept flashing through my head. Still, my curiosity won me over. I have to know going forward. I gradually turned the knob to open the door. The embers of the fire long ago extinguished, the living room dark. But my blood ran cold when my eyes acclimated to the darkness. In the middle of the room there stood a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, lanky limbs that seemed to twist in odd directions. Its eyes, God, were pale, nearly transparent. Its skin was also. Black, bottomless depths that appeared to stare straight through me seemed to be. When I opened my mouth to yell, nothing came out. The apparition inclined its head as though thinking about me. It then started to talk. "You broke the rules," it murmured. its voice like dead leaf rustling. "You have to pay the price now." Heart hammering in my chest, I staggered backwards. The man moved awkwardly and unnaturally, then stepped toward me, with hands shaking so severely I could hardly turn the doorknob. I flew into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. Amara sat up in bed, terror and uncertainty wide in her eyes. "Jasper, what is going on?" Shaking my head, I tried to gather my air. "Here's something out there," I choked out. "In the room for living. We have to leave this place." The face of Amara turned white. She leaped from bed and began gathering our bags, cramming basics and clothing inside. Shaking the children awake, I hurried to their room and instructed them to change immediately. We were ready to depart in minutes. Half expecting to see the figure in the clearing, I peeped out the window, but all that was there was the black contour of the trees against the bright heavens. Our bags thrown over our shoulders, we swung out of the cabin. The cool, clear night air nipped at my bare flesh. Hurrying to get to the car, we piled inside and threw our luggage in the trunk. Heart thumping in my chest, I turned the key in the ignition, but just a sputtering cough replaced the reassuring roar of the engine. I gave another try, but the car wouldn't start. Wonderful! Furious, I smashed my palms against the driving wheel. The battery has to be dead. Amara stared at me, terror widening her eyes. What are our next actions? Breathing deeply, I tried to slow down my rushing ideas. We must wait till daybreak. We cannot meander aimlessly across the dark woodland. Seeking warmth as the temperature fell, we crowded about in the automobile. Weary after the exhilaration of the evening, the children nodded off fast. Still, Amara and I watched the shadows dance outside the windows. We first heard it just before morning, a low, sorrowful wail echoing across the woods. It was followed by still another, then still another, until the sound appeared to be alive throughout the woodland. Amara seized my arm and her fingers sank into my flesh. "Jasper, what is that?" I shook my head, my mouth dry with terror. "I'm not certain, but I doubt our desire to learn." Sitting there, we listened to the cries approach ever closer. We then spotted them among the woods. Shadows traveling between the trees of twisted, strange forms. Though I choked it back down, I sensed a scream rising in my throat. I wanted the children to know how afraid I was. For them, I had to be solid. I braced myself for the worst as the shadows stretched toward the edge of the clearing. Rather than attacking, though, they seemed to pause. Like waiting for something, they whirled around the edge of the trees. And then I recalled the 8th guideline from the list: leave an offering on the porch every night. We had left nothing out in our hurry to get away. I blamed myself for not paying the regulations more thought. But already it was too late. With every second, the outlines of the shadows grew more solid as they grew nearer. My voice little above a whisper, I turned to Amara. "We have to grab at it quickly. Once more back to the cabin. Our only opportunity is this one." She nodded, her face pallid but resolved. Telling the youngsters we were going to play a game, we woke them as gently as we could. Whoever made it back to the cabin first would win. We had to be incredibly swift and quiet. Their eyes wide with a mixture of exhilaration and terror, they nodded. From 3, we counted down. Then we were sprinting, our feet thumping the hard-packed ground. The shadows behind us were howls developing into snarls as they pursued. I glanced over my shoulder and wished right away I hadn't. Their bodies now entirely substantial, their eyes gleaming red in the pre-dawn light. They were closer than I had supposed. We exploded through the cabin door and slammed it closed behind us. To block the door, I slipped the hefty wooden bar I had taken from the wall into position. Gasping for air, we dropped to the floor, crying The children were clinging to Amara as though she were a life raft. Trying to provide whatever meager consolation I could, I encircled each one. Outside, the howls disappeared to be replaced by a terrible silence. I knew, though, they were still out there, waiting for us to make even another error. We were imprisoned without means of escape or call for assistance, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation we were being watched as the sun rose over the mountains and sent pale light through the windows. The day drifted in a cloud of anxiety and strain. Gathering at the cabin, we jumped at every creak and groan of the old wood. I kept eye on the windows, looking for movement on the tree line. Still, nothing existed. The shadows seemed to have disappeared with the rising sun, leaving no trace at all. I might have persuaded myself it had all been a dream without the barred door and the residual fear in the pit of my stomach. Once more night fell, the fear returned. We assembled in the living room, the same space I had seen the figure in the previous evening. Afraid the light may draw unwelcome attention, we refrained from starting a fire. Rather, we gathered on the couch in the gloom. The children had at last entered a tired sleep, but Amara and I stayed up, our ears straying for any outside noise. We heard it at about midnight. At the door, a gentle, forceful scratch. Scattering on the wood, it sounded like claws. Her fingers shaking, Amara's hand found mine in the darkness. It all began almost a year ago as I was working late in downtown Chicago. Working long hours to attempt to make a good impression, I was a junior associate in a large legal firm. I left the office at last about 11:30 p.m., just wanting to get home to my Lincoln Park condo. I was tired. I headed to catch the red line from the State Lake stop. The platform nearly was empty when I arrived. Just a few more late-night passengers lingering about. At that time of night, the train was scheduled to arrive every 15 minutes, but after 20 minutes it was nowhere to be seen. When this elderly woman approached me, I was beginning to become agitated. Her aged face and grey hair suggested she might be in her 70s. She had on an old-fashioned-looking coat and cap. "Excuse me, young man," she continued, "but you might want to consider choosing another train." I felt perplexed. "What precisely do you mean? Only one train runs to my stop." Her head shook. "The last train arriving, it is not correct. Not safe." I laughed a little, considering her to be just some eccentric elderly person. "Thank you, I will be good. My only want is to get home." She sighed and dug into her pocket. She drew out some paper and handed it to me. "You must follow these guidelines if you are determined on riding this train. To the letter. Alternatively..." She drifted off and turned away before I could probe her meaning. I lowered myself to the paper. Written in this old-fashioned script, the 9 rules were: A. List before your stop. Do not try to get off the train. 2. Never stare straight at any other passenger. 3. React negatively if a passenger tries to chat to you. 4. Don't go to sleep. Should you hear whispers, cover your ears and hum loudly. Should the lights flutter, close your eyes and count to 10. 7. Never try to operate any other electronic gadget or your phone. 8. Breathe and pray if you smell something burning. 9. Get off the train straight away when you get to your station. Look forward, never turn around. Reading over the list made me increasingly uncomfortable. This needed to be some sort of joke, right? Still, something about the warning from the elderly woman stayed with me. Right then, the train showed up. The doors opened hissing and I entered. Just a few other people were strewn throughout the nearly empty car. Finding a seat, I settled down with a list of guidelines in hand. I felt as though something was off when the train left the station. The lights appeared less than usual, and the air smelled oddly like something burning. I peered at the other travelers. A businessman in a suit was typing on his phone while head down. Bobbing her head to music, a young woman carrying headphones enters, reading a newspaper, an older man. Everything appeared to be in line, but as I watched, the guy set his phone down and raised his head. And at that I noticed his face. Alternatively, where his face ought to have been, not even a hint of anything. Simply smooth, blank skin, without eyes, without nose, without mouth. Blinking, I realized I had to be seeing things. Looking once more, though, his face was still absent. I experienced a panic attack. This cannot be reality. Looking at the other passengers, I horrifiedly found they were all the same. Simply blank, featureless heads, no faces. My hands shaking, I descended to study the set of guidelines. "Don't stare directly at any other passenger," advised it. I had breached the second guideline previously. I sat there, paralyzed with terror, wondering what I had gotten myself into as the train whirled on through the dark tunnels. And that was only the start of the dream the last train home carried. My heart thumping in my chest, I sat there not looking at the other people. The train rocked forward, the lights flickering above. I kept staring down the rule list, trying to commit them to memory, believing they would somehow protect me. The young woman sporting headphones removed them and turned to face me. I turned away fast, recalling second rule. However, it was too late. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched her get up and move toward me. Looking about for somewhere to go, I fretted and found nowhere. I found myself on this dream train, caught. The woman persisted, her motions stiff and strange. The older man with a newspaper got up suddenly. "Hey!" He yelled at the woman. "Leave the youngster alone!" The woman turned toward him and I recognized her face. Better still, the lack of it. Like the business person, there was nothing there. The elderly guy staggered back, his newspaper tumbling to the ground, and seemed to understand this too. The woman shot at him, hands outstretched. Her fingers sinking into his skin, the man yelled. To my horror, then he began to dissolve. His muscles, his skin, even his bones melted away like wax until all that remained was his garments in a puddle on the floor. Though no sound came out, I longed to scream. The woman turned back toward me, and I closed my eyes in time for the end. But nothing changed. She was seated, headphones on, as like nothing had happened when I opened my eyes once more. I started looking frantically. Still faceless, still texting on his phone, the businessman was there. There was no indication the old man had ever been his. Clothing were gone. I thought I might go crazy. There cannot be this occurring. It needed to be a dream or a delusion. Still, the panic, the anxiety was all too real. At the next station, the train halted and hissed open the doors. A small number more people boarded. At first they seemed normal, but as they sat down their faces started to melt away, same as the others. With hands shaking so severely I could hardly read the list of guidelines. I had to leave this place. Rule number 1, though, was unambiguous. Do not attempt to leave the train before your stop. The train got going once more, accelerating. The burning scent grew stronger as the lights flickering more fiercely changed. Then, whispering from somewhere behind me, I heard, though the words eluded me, the sound made me shudder. Rule number 5, if you hear whispering, cover your ears and hum loudly, came back to me feeling stupid but too terrified to care. I clapped my hands over my ears and started to hum. The whispers grew louder, erasing even my own humming sound. All murmuring different things, it sounded as though hundreds of voices. I closed my eyes, hummed louder, tried to block it out. Then I heard a scream amid the chorus of whispering. My eyes flew open. Gone was the young woman with the headphones, her garments piled on her seat. Standing above them, the businessman had a blank face directed toward me. I stopped, not wanting to move, starting to walk toward me. The businessman moved like a marionette on strings, stiff and jerky. Desperate, I searched about but found no path of escape. The lights went out totally just as he arrived. The only sound the train made was rattling. My own heart pounded as I sank into absolute darkness. Rule 6. If the lights flutter, close your eyes and count to 10. Came to me. With shaky voice, I closed my eyes and began counting. 1, TT3, footsteps, slow and dragging, grew louder as I approached. 4, F5, 6. Cold and slimy, a hand swept my arm. I stammered away, counting more quickly. 7, E, that N9. The feet came to a standstill. I could feel someone directly in front of me breathing on my face. 10. I let my eyes open. The lights were flickering, dim but back on. Back in his seat, the guy began typing on his phone as like nothing had occurred. Shaking, I sat there hardly daring to breathe. How much more of this I could consume? I had no idea. Looking up on the map above the door, I tried to estimate the remaining stop count. But I was horrified to find the map had changed. Names for the pauses included dispersion, madness, and oblivion. And the line ended, where my stop ought to have been, only marked the end. A tsunami of despair swept over me. Exists any way out of this dream? Was I destined to ride this train always, or until I broke one too many laws and turned out like the others? Then, though, I recalled rule number 9. When you reach your stop, depart the train promptly. Look forward only, never turn around. Perhaps there was the secret. Perhaps I might flee this torment if only I could reach my stop. But given the altered map, when I had no idea where my stop was. Now, I sat there trying to hang on to my sanity and work out a means of surviving the last train home as it rumbled on. The train tore over the night, the whispers getting louder while the lights fluttered. Holding the rule list, I sat there trying to find a way out of this dream. I turned to face the other passengers, that is, what remained. The young woman, the businessman, left just mounds of clothing behind when they disappeared. The only one remaining was me, the only one who had complied with regulations. But for what length of time more? I could see my hold on reality erasing itself and the craziness of this place seeping into me. I had to act and make it out before it was too late. I once more studied the map at the odd, menacing names of the stops. And that's when I observed something. Their stops created a pattern. Despair, madness, oblivion. They were all mental states, phases of loss from oneself. And the end of the sentence, the end, perhaps was hardly a location at all. Perhaps it was a condition of being, the last stage of caving in to the craziness. That then made me know what I had to do. I had to hang on to myself, my sanity, my identity, resist. I had to find my own stop and path out. Closing my eyes, I blocked the murmuring voices and flickering lights. I concentrated on my breathing and on the pulse of my heart. I considered my life, my family, my buddies. I considered everything that helped me to become the person I am. I started singing then as well. My mother used to sing an old song to me when I was young. I sung it loudly, drowning out the whispers by filling the train car. I sensed transformation as I sung. The air appeared to be becoming lighter, the stifling gloom dispersing. When I opened my eyes, the map began to shift. Astoundingly, familiar streets and landmarks were taking over from the unusual, horrible stop names. And my stop, my home, was there at the end of the line. The train started to slow, the brakes screaming as it came into the station. The doors opened and I staggered onto the platform, hardly daring to think it was real. Turning back to check the train, I could have sworn I spotted the elderly woman from the platform, the one who had handed me the sheet of rules. She was grinning at me while seated by the window. Then she disappeared in a flash, and the train vanished into the darkness as though it had never existed. Shaking, I stood on the platform trying to sort out what had just happened. Had that all been real? Alternatively, was it only a dream, the result of my overworked, tired mind? I dropped my hand down and saw the rule list curled in my fist. It was actual concrete evidence that I had not dreamt it all. If I'd disobeyed those guidelines or turned myself over to the train's craziness, I'm not sure what would have occurred. I do know, though, that occasionally I meet people who seem a bit too blank, a little too expressionless on the late train home following a demanding day at work. And in those times, I hang fast to my sanity and sense of self. Since we cannot understand some things in this world right now, horrors hiding in the shadow of our daily existence. And clinging to who we are and refusing to let go of the things that define us is the only way we will survive them. We have to keep singing our song even through the worst of darkness and deepest hopelessness. I never forget the lesson I learnt on the last train home, since at the end it's not about the destination. It's about the road and the people we decide to travel alongside. Last summer, my friends Liam, Olivia, and I decided to investigate the closed Wonderland amusement park just outside of Oakwood, Ohio. Rumors about the location, that it closed in the 1980s following a string of mishaps, that the proprietor had gone insane and vanished into the park, that the souls of those who passed there still tormented the grounds, had circulated. But we were young and dumb, and the thought of touring a real-life ghost town was too fascinating to turn down. On a sweltering July day, the sun scorching the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, we drove out there. Liam had brought bolt cutters, so we quickly worked on the corroded lock even though the park entry was locked shut. Though it was hot, I shivered down my spine as we passed the gates. The environment was absolutely still, the only sound the far-off groaning of ancient metal and the buzzing of insects in the overgrown grass. We passed boarded-own ticket booths and faded signs as we descended the main road. And that's when we noticed it, a big, battered sign at the trail bifurcation. "Welcome to Wonderland! Read here. Please apply these 6 guidelines for your enjoyment and safety. Remain always on the designated paths. 2. Leave no structures or attractions entered. 3. Do not handle or take anything away. 4. Steer clear of too loud noise. 5. Don't linger past sundown. 6. Leave right away if you spot anything odd. Ignoring these guidelines could lead to major injury or death. Thank you for your visit." A little uncomfortable, we all turned to face one another. Olivia merely chuckled, though, and remarked, "Ooh, frightening. Their goal is simply to frighten us away. Come on, let us go explore." She marched off the left-hand road, and Liam and I trailed after a moment's doubt. I felt as we strolled that we were under observation. The hair on the back of my neck sprang up, and I kept staring over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Our first visit was to the Scream Machine, a massive run-down roller coaster. The automobile stood immobile on the hill like the skeleton of some long-dead beast, the tracks corroded. Ignoring the "Do not enter" signs, Olivia began ascending the stairs to the platform right away. Though we followed her, Liam and I exchanged a glance. Perched at the summit, we peered across the park. We could clearly see how huge and empty it was from this elevation. Like a metropolis after the apocalypse, overgrown rides and boarded-own buildings extended out as far as the eye could see. Leaching over the railing, Olivia peered down at the tracks below. "Imagine riding this thing when it was running," she remarked. "It had to have been a real delight." A breeze passed the platform just then, bearing with it the faint sound of laughter. We all stopped and searched about for the source, but nobody turned up. "Did you folks hear that?" My voice quivering somewhat, I asked. Liam nodded his head. "That was only the wind, Guy. This place is getting to you." I was unsure, though. I kept thinking that we had just violated the second rule as we descended the stairs. For a few more hours, we looked about deserted game booths and peered through the windows of boarded-off gift stores. We even came onto an ancient carousel, its once bright horses now chipped and faded, their eyes apparently following us as we passed by. I became uncomfortable, though, as the sun began to drop into the horizon and broad shadows across the park emerged. I kept considering the fifth rule: do not stay past sunset. Trying to keep my voice laid back, "Hey guys," I said, "it's becoming really late. Perhaps we should start on our way back." Olivia let her eyes roll back. "Don't be a baby, Kai. Not that kind. We are only now reaching the worthwhile stuff." She gestured toward the end of the road to a big run-down structure, benevolent funhouse faded sign above the door. She said, "Let's check it out." Smiled. "I bet that there's all kinds of awesome stuff in there." Liam stopped. "Liv, I'm not sure. That location appears to be really shoddy." Olivia was already headed for it, though, and we followed a moment later. I couldn't get rid of the sense that we were making a horrible mistake as we neared the funhouse. The funhouse's entrance hung off its hinges, and as soon as we entered, I felt a wave of musty rot. Old tickets, broken glass, moldy plush animals all piled on the floor. Originally vibrant murals, the walls now showed fading and peeling. Olivia reached for her phone and turned on the torch. The ray sliced across the darkness to show a twisted corridor ahead of us. She murmured, "Come on," her voice resonating in the stillness. "Let's see what's down here." We moved along the hall, dodging low-hanging beams and across piles of debris. We would cross a gateway leading off into darkness every so often, but Olivia kept moving onward, driven by some invisible power. I couldn't get rid of the impression that we were being watched as we strolled. Soft footsteps behind us, the whisper of cloth brushing against the walls persisted, but there was nothing there each time I looked around. We came out into a big round chamber, a raised platform in the middle encircled by a muddy water moat. On the stage stood a tarnished metal throne, whose once shiny surface now was dingy and pitted. Grinning, Olivia ascended upon the platform and settled on the throne. "Hey everybody, look at me! I am Wonderland's royal queen!" I laughed with Liam, but in the stifling hush of the room it sounded empty. I saw something glistening in Olivia's spotlight as she got up to explore farther. Laying in a crevice of the throne, it was a little silver key. I stretched out to grab it, but as my fingers closed around it, my hand suddenly hurt sharply. I yelped, dropped the key, then studied my palm. There was a tiny, deep-cut bleeding. Liam scumbled. "Oh, nice, man." I nodded and sipped on the hurt. "Yeah, just cut yourself on whatever. Let's keep on going." We exited the throne room and headed farther into the funhouse. We strolled and the air seemed to get colder. I shivered and rubbed my arms. The idea that we were being observation and that something was hiding just out of sight persisted. We arrived in still another chamber, mirror-filled, reflecting our images back at us in limitless, distorted repeats. They covered the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Olivia giggled and started drawing faces at herself, but I couldn't get myself to participate. The mirrors bothered me in a way that made my skin crawl. I kept glances of movement out of the corner of my eye as we negotiated the labyrinth of ideas, a shadow zipping behind us, a face peering out of the glass. But there was nothing there every time I turned to check. At last we surfaced into the funhouse's last room. With low ceilings and walls painted a rich, dark red, it was smaller than the others. A little circular stage flanked by a handful of mouldering chairs stood in the middle of the room. On the stage was a slumped-over person as though asleep. I was shocked to see as we got closer that it was a clown, or at least that had been once. Its white face paint chipped and peeled, its outfit ragged and dirty. Its mouth hung open in a terrible parodies of a smile, its eyes closed. Olivia moved nearer, her flashlight beams sweeping over the clown's face. "Guys, have a look at this. That is quite eerie." The clown's eyes opened suddenly. Eyes fastened on Olivia with a terrible intensity. Eyes were a brilliant, piercing blue. Its mouth opened to show rows of sharp, yellowed teeth in a broad, leering smile. Olivia dropped her phone and shrieked, staggered backward. Rising from its chair, the clown rose moves awkwardly and unnaturally. Its fingers curled like claws, and its arms spread pointed toward us. We bolted, back along the twisting hallways from the mirror maze past the throne room. Behind us, I could hear the clown, its laughter shrill and frantic, its feet slow and laboring. We staggered from the funhouse, panting for breath. The park darkened as the sun sank below the horizon. The parking lot lights were hardly visible in the distance. I painedly grabbed Olivia's arm and said, "We have to get out of here. Now." But I knew with a sickening feeling that we had violated practically every rule on the list as we raced for the door. We had walked past sunset, touched stuff, gone into buildings and created noise. And now I knew we were about to pay for it as the clown's laughing filled the vacant park. Running across the park, we stumbled over trash and roots under darkness. Mixed with other noises, the creaking of aged metal, the groaning of old wood, the whisper of dead leaves in the wind, I could hear the laughter of the clown moving closer behind us. We passed the carousel, and I peered over my shoulder only once. The horses were moving, their jaws snapped at the air, their eyes glowed crimson in the night. Riding on the lead horse was the clown. Its face was stretched into a crazy smile, and its eyes were squarely on us with ravenous intensity. Our hearts thumping, our lungs burning, we accelerated. The scream machine passed, its vehicles now full of dark individuals with closed mouths in quiet screams. We passed the game booths. The stuffed animals were crawling with maggots, the prizes twisted and decaying, and everywhere the park's spirits were encirclement of us. The spirits of those who had never left and those who had passed away here. Their faces twisted in wrath and suffering, they reached for us with phantom hands. When we at last arrived at the gate, we were horrified to find it closed. The padlock now entire and shining as though it had never been touched. The chain we had cut lay on a heap on the ground. Olivia ruckled the gate, her voice frantic and shrill. "It isn't open! We are ensnared!" Liam turned to glance around wildly. There must be still another path out. We could perhaps scale the fence. But I realized it was useless when I gazed at the soaring fence covered with razor wire coils. Trapped at the will of the evil spirits we had released. And I then recalled the key, the little silver key I had discovered in the throne room, the one that had sliced my hand. My fingers shaking, I pulled it from my pocket. "Guys," I whispered just above a whisper, "I guess I know how to leave here." Olivia's eyes grew wide when I raised the key. "Where did you come upon that?" "In the funhouse," I said. "I believe it's the key to the gate." Liam shook his head. "But how will you know it will work?" "I never did. But our sole hope was this. Rising forward, I put the key into the padlock. Not one thing happened for a moment. The lock then clicked softly to open. The clown's laughter and the howling of the spirits receding behind us drove us across the fence into the parking lot. Tires screaming on the tarmac, we jumped into Liam's car and drove out of the lot. Our hearts slowed, our breathing returned to normal, and we drove silently for a protracted period. Olivia finally spoke, her voice trembling. "What the hell was that place?" she asked. I gave my head a shake. "I am unsure, but I don't believe we were supposed to be present. We released something nasty, I believe." In the rearview mirror, Liam peered at me. "Still, we left right? Right now, we're safe." Not quite sure either. I could still feel the wound on my hand pulsing, could still hear the clown's laughter echoing in my thoughts. I felt as though our experience was not yet finished, and I was right as well. Odd events began throughout the next weeks. Objects moving on their own, shadows seen out the side of the eye, murmurs in the darkness, and constantly of something waiting just out of sight, of being watched. I told myself it was only my imagination. The horror of that evening was playing havoc with my mental state. Deeply yet, I knew the truth. From Wonderland, we had carried something back that wouldn't rest until it claimed us for its own. About Olivia and Liam, I'm not sure what happened. After that evening, we drifted apart and each of us tried to process the trauma in our unique manner. Still, occasionally late at night, I will get a call from an unidentified number, and when I respond, all I hear is laughing, high and mocking and nasty. These days I am aware of some areas that should never be disturbed and some secrets that should never be discovered. And follow my advice if you ever find yourself standing at the gate of an abandoned amusement park. A list of guidelines put there. Rotate around. Distance yourself. Never, ever glance behind as well. Because in Wonderland, the only way to win is not to participate at all.